Hi, everyone. Welcome to this special edition podcast episode sponsored by Open Societies Foundations. On the sidelines of the World Bank IMF spring meetings here in Washington, D.C., I'm Kate Warren, Executive Vice President and Executive Editor at Devex, and delighted to be bringing a conversation that you don't hear about in every development circle, but you probably will start hearing about or should start hearing about, and that's about critical raw materials. So these include the minerals that power everything from clean energy tech to smartphones, electric vehicles, even AI systems. And the problem is that the benefits and the value from these are not necessarily evenly distributed. And we're seeing critical minerals really become at the center of global power struggles, supply chain shocks, and then really hard questions about equity, governance, and sustainability. So I'm really delighted to be joined by two incredible minds to talk about this issue and what are the opportunities and challenges, particularly when we think about a development context in critical raw materials. We have Elena Pavlenko, president and co-founder of Dixie Group in Ukraine, who's been deeply involved in shaping her country's CRM strategy and amidst war and recovery and really shifting power alliances. And we have Brian Kagoro, Managing Director of Programs at the Open Societies Foundation, whose work spans democracy, justice, and development across the African continent and beyond. So thank you both so much for being here today. So, Elena, I'm going to start with the basics because for many people, critical raw materials, rare minerals still feel kind of abstract, geological term or very specific to trade. So could you just talk a little bit about why CRMs are so essential to the global economy right now and how that's even really shifted in the past few years?
Sure. So first of all, the world is talking about going from fossil fuels and decarbonization and how we should do the green transition. And green transition usually means electrification. Yes, we getting rid of the gas or coal, but we'll use more electricity for heating, for cooling, for cooking, even for mobility using the electric vehicles. But all of this will need the relevant equipment, and this relevant equipment demands critical raw materials. For example, electric vehicles, they need 6 times more critical minerals than the ordinary car, and the wind plant needs 8 times more critical minerals than the coal-fired plant. So all this actually will create a huge demand in critical raw materials in the future. And the same, we can talk about the defense sector. We do see now how the countries increasingly start to discuss about the, further development of their military sectors, and everything in the military will demand critical raw materials as well, for the weapons, for the tanks, for the, I don't know, for everything. This is where the countries also will depend on the reserves of critical minerals in the future.
Yeah, and so Brian, thinking about from a broader development and justice lens, what are the implications for countries, particularly in Africa where you have a lot of experience, that face barriers to either accessing or benefiting from these CRM-rich materials? A lot of countries in the African continent contain many of these materials, but aren't necessarily the beneficiaries of a lot of the value that's extracted from them.
So the history, whether you call it colonial or other history, created an ownership structure where a lot of the capacity to and also and a lot of the exploitation of all natural resources, including critical raw materials, was controlled by external companies. And then in the post-independence moment, it also became controlled by, let me just call them powerful external interests. And in Africa at the moment, it is the US, it is China, Russia in some instances, Saudi Arabia in others. And the race, as I think Elena said, the race for alternatives to hydrocarbons in energy has recreated a historical competition amongst both great and middle powers for these raw materials. It's threefold. Number one, it's to control the supply. Number two, it's the control of the value chains, which is the value addition, the beneficiation, and therefore the technology and intellectual property rights that enable anyone to benefit. Number three, it's the scarcity of independent resourcing for these. So they are capital intensive in order to exploit. A lot of these African countries that are debt stripped are not capable of raising resources independently from just the domestic fiscus to finance. And yet, if the deal making, if the contracts around critical minerals were fair and equitable, the critical minerals could become a way for Africa to exit the debt trap. It also could become a way for Africa to create employment. It's a largely youthful continent with over 70% of the population being under the age of 35. It essentially would help with the creation of employment. But critical minerals exploitation at the moment, following that old paradigm, essentially means you take raw materials, there's no value addition, so you can't create significant number of sustainable jobs. It also means that you buy finished products from the raw materials you've provided at a much higher cost. In order to afford that technology that has been made from your raw materials, you borrow. So the debt cycle deepens. The impact on the environment is more far-reaching than it was for hydrocarbons. I think Elena has already talked about the quantities that you need, right? The lowering of labor standards, lowering of environmental standards, so that whether it's air quality, water quality, presents new challenges with health. But the land you require to produce also is land that's been taken from agricultural production. So it impacts food sovereignty, food security. So the social negative impacts and the potential positive impacts need to be balanced. And that balance lies in negotiation of contracts, restructuring not just of a domestic tax system so that you're able to obtain appropriate rents and revenues. It's the international system, the infrastructure that enables you to enforce certain ethical standards, environmental standards, and etc. Needs to be rethought. So there are very specific domestic level questions around linked to education. So that point is often not made as strongly. For critical minerals beneficiation require a range of skills that most countries outside of China and maybe a little bit in the US do not have. Even the US doesn't have all so if you take just the battery, the lithium battery related or lithium related value chains, the sort of skills that are required, even developed nations sometimes don't have enough. Those who do suffer the second problem, that the market is already saturated, the concentration of capacity in certain countries. Or they suffer the third, the control of export and certain other additives that you need to do this. Fundamental challenge, as Helena said in an earlier conversation, is until countries and regions determine the criticality of certain minerals and the link of such criticality to their own industrialization, to their own economic transformation, then all they do is rely on an assessment that's anchored on or based on the needs of other countries. So there is something African countries and peoples should be able to do to avert the environmental degradation, violation of rights, also to build a competitive edge. And this, I suggested that African countries have to do in alliance and in partnership with other countries, with Ukraine, with Indonesia, with other countries elsewhere, because that mutual learning is important. So I think that's a very important thing, that you can't address the human rights, the environmental sustainability question, and the economic questions in tandem without building a very broad partnership, domestic and regional and international.
Yeah, so Len, I'd love to get your perspective from Ukraine, and maybe by the time this podcast published, it'll be a done deal, but there is negotiations between Ukraine and US on a partnership. And, it's not just about access to minerals, it's about, what's being traded for access and how that is negotiated. And really, as you think about in your country having these resources that both can finance your own development and security and energy independence, but also be used as a way to trade, right? For other things that might benefit you. How do you think about balancing some of those considerations? And from your experience in Ukraine, what advice would you have to other countries who also are rich in these materials, and how to think about, maximizing that value amidst it was a lot of competition for these right now?
Thanks. Again, as was already said, if you are a resource-rich country and you want to benefit from this, probably first you have to understand whether these resources you will need for your own economic development. That's why development of your own critical mineral strategy and linking it to the future economic development is really important for every country. And then when you understand what you need, then you can understand what you can trade, right? And to how extent and under what conditions. And then all these questions, it will be much more easier to answer. And if you understand what you can trade, then the question is, what could be the best, structure, format of negotiations and the deal. And here where the international community can help with the first some templates, or benchmarks, what the good deal is if you are in a weaker position than your counterpart. And also they can help with the standards. So you can understand what standards you can put into your deal, into your contracts, in order to make sure that there will be not long-term harm for your country, for your sectors, for your communities, environment, and others. So all this actually are lessons learned from the process we are going now. And for the countries who would like to develop their own critical raw material sector, I would recommend to start from thinking what exactly they want to have in their future by using the critical raw materials.
And Brian, thinking about the role of civil society, so there's a big role for industry, for governments or multilateral institutions or at the national level. But what role can and should civil society play in ensuring that minimizing the economic or the environmental damage that you cited that can happen, and being able to make sure that they have a seat at the table? Many of these communities where these resources are being extracted from, a lot of impacts that could be negative or positive. Where do you see them fitting into this conversation? What more do you think needs to be done to ensure that they are part of the conversation?
Civil society has 5 interesting roles. The one is the knowledge. In the critical minerals sector, information and knowledge asymmetry is a core issue. Often communities and governments, supplier governments, don't know as much as they should in order to negotiate optimally or to optimize benefits. Addressing that gap in knowledge and information becomes key. And relatedly, this issue of skills and capacities to do the monitoring and the evaluation, especially of violations, whether this is air quality, water quality, or it's violations where other things are being affected in the medium to long term. But these two functions assume that they are regulatory standards, that there is an enabling regulatory framework. So civil society plays a critical role in ensuring that there are regulations, appropriate regulations at the national level, regional level, and international level, So civil society advocacy for such regulatory frameworks. And one assumes regulatory frameworks come up with enforcement mechanisms. The fourth is on the question of resourcing. Often we think about resourcing or funding or financing purely as in how to finance the exploration, the exploitation, etc. But we have to be thinking about in building local economies, local content laws, value addition. In Africa, for example, there's the Africa Mining Vision, which has very wonderful components about backward, forward, upward linkages to the rest of the economy, to education, to infrastructure, and etc. It's useful that civil society gets into the economics of critical minerals. Often we talk at the social policy, at the ideological level, at the values level. It's important to understand the economics. And I think that in developing local economies, there's a fifth role. What is transformative local economic participation as the gateway to democratizing the sector? We spoke earlier about things that may not make economic sense, but that are very important. So whilst critical minerals offer a great option to hydrocarbons, there is also much lower levels of recycling, which therefore means the dependencies on the current monopolies in the sector are self-perpetuating. There is a gap between what makes current economic sense, what makes future environmental sense, and where the communities and the peoples are. And that gap has to be filled through not just advocacy by civil society, but designing social enterprises that fill the gap, whether it's working with angel funds, within philanthropies, and with others. We think that the traditional role of civil society, which is watching what the state does, what corporates do, will be important. But what's most important is that the old role of civil society empowering. And by civil society here, I'm describing the social movements, the communities, indigenous communities, describing the think tanks, describing the labor unions, describing the broad coalition that's required. I think they have a role to create visions of the future, not just of mining, but of transformative, when we're talking about just energy transition, of what sort of versions and variations of justice will constitute the just energy transition, and what role critical minerals play in that. That means civil society has to transform itself. There are new skills civil society needs to learn. There are new approaches, new tactics, including negotiation. Because if we have this great power contest and we have this middle power interest, and the geopolitics is complex, so you can't have only purely doctrinaire positions on issues. In order to facilitate, to enable, to exercise allyship and solidarity with affected and impacted communities, civil society needs a much more complex approach. It needs a transnational approach, which means linking civil society in the supplier countries and civil society in the consumer countries. It also means linking various layers and levels of community in order to generate a global voice.
And Elena, how are you seeing civil society play a role in Ukraine, both at that local, national, as well as international level?
Yeah, we always joke that the civil society in Ukraine, they are all kind of dogs. The slide dogs, the watch dogs, oven dogs. Because civil society, and I totally agree, civil society should be much more knowledgeable, much more active, much more flexible than the governments in order to make a pressure on the one side and advice on the other side, monitor on the third side, communicate with all the stakeholders on the animal forest side. So they should have a lot of roles in order to be on driver's seat of reforms and changes. I think civil society in Ukraine is doing its best, taking into account also the war that a lot of people are involved into the volunteering and support to the army, but they also support a lot the government with the development of policies which meet the international standards and European standards. They also support with the more strategic work, with the development of strategies, communication with local communities. And I have to say that such instruments as Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, other international initiatives, they are very much helpful because they create the platforms, the space where such multi-stakeholder dialogue might happen at the local level, at the national level, and also at the international level. So I think those ideas or initiatives to create such spaces for the discussions, it's very much helpful. And the second is support from different think tanks, international think tanks, and donors in order to, again, stay independent, but also learn about other countries, about other good examples, about other experience which they can bring to Ukraine, for example. And that's where the government is in a weaker position because government is much more involved in everyday work, in the implementation something, developing something, and civil society, because it's much more flexible, independent, faster. They can learn more.
And so, Brian, you mentioned some of the geopolitical challenges, and again, we're here in DC on the sidelines of the World Bank and IMF spring meetings at a moment when multilateralism is really under threat, and there's a real growing movement of more isolationism. And when you have this, I guess, environment of fierce competition, bit of a sense of zero-sum game, and less of an emphasis on cooperation, what do you think the international community should do, and how do you create incentives for more collaboration amidst particularly this moment where it feels like we're pulling further away from that rather than walking more towards it?
I think this moment is both unique but an echo of a past moment where it seemed we were heading towards a third world war, and the global peace movement helped us pull ourselves from the edge of a precipice. We do need a globalism or a global alliance of affected communities and countries that doesn't define itself in terms of who it opposes or supports, but that defines itself on what is the right thing to do. So a lot of the civil society work has been about the do no harm principles, but there needs to be an articulation of what it means to do good and to do good for the common humanity. This may mean the conversations that have gone on business and human rights, the conversations that have gone on human security, the conversations that have gone on international transparency and accountability, the conversations that have gone on global equity, global commons, governance, and etc., and the conversations that have gone on accessible and affordable energy for all, and the broader conversation on access to justice need now to converge. How do they converge? I am persuaded that the number of people who believe that collaborative and cooperative resolution of international differences and disputes are more than those who are looking at very antagonistic ways and means of settling these disputes. The people who believe in equitable, just, and inclusive trade are more than those who are looking towards protectionism, a much narrower sense. The difference is that those who are championing a vision that's narrow and potentially destructive of the rest and of international cooperation are louder and more organized. Those who actually believe in a world where we all can equitably share and live in harmony with nature and with each other need to be better organized more organized to articulate. The commitment to standards that the Europeans, the commitment to standards that the Africans, ASEAN nations, the commitment to standards that we've seen in the Caribbean means that the majority of nations actually want a world order that can stop the scourge of climate change, that can stop the challenges we face with hunger, food insecurity and war, such as we're seeing in the Ukraine. But these groups have been fragmented often on points of difference and have not invested enough in finding the points of convergence. And I think this moment behoves all of us to start encouraging peoples, nations, organizations, regional organizations, private sector actors, think tanks, to start aligning and finding each other on the things they agree on. And because multilateralism won't be saved by the goodwill of individual states. It is the collective will of people, the same collective will that after the Holocaust said no, the same collective will that after colonialism said no, the same collective will that stopped us from getting into a third world war. We cannot return to an arms race. We cannot return to where egos of very powerful men drive institutions and states and drive the entire globe into self-destruction. But it essentially means that faith-based institutions, traditional leaderships, security chiefs, because this conversation on critical minerals will not be settled without bringing defense industries, heads of militaries, heads of industries and commerce, civil society, and other interested parties to the table. There is a popular multilateralism of the people, which essentially means we have to grow a new adaptability to take from Elena, to talk to people that we may not 100% agree with, but we share a common desire to see a world that's more sustainable ecologically, more sustainable economically, more sustainable socially. And that's the battle we face. It's not for people to become puritanical. It's not for people to become vindictive. It's not for people to become insular. It's for people to take a view that says, what's good for us all is good for the individual. So in finding that collective will, it's important for us to fight. It's also important for us to reach out to those who hold a different view. We may not persuade them through words, but it is important for us to understand what makes them not want the world we desire. And that will help us couch strategies that perhaps may win over a huge number of people who may be saying, I agree with part of the argument this side and the part of the argument that side. Ultimately, what I'm saying to you is the answer to your question is leadership. Leadership at all levels, but bold, courageous, innovative leadership. It's not for old men or middle-aged men only. We got to reach out to the young people across the world. Their visions and visions of the world must not be colored and tainted by this moment of both grandstanding, politics of unpleasantness and vindictiveness. And finding those young people who actually believe they are the majority and making sure that they commit themselves to a world where collaboration, cooperation is the better way than warfare and a Stone Age mentality that depends on who has the biggest stick or the largest stone. And that will be important.
And then is there reason for optimism that this vision that Brian laid out on cooperation can and will happen?
Of course. We have to be optimistic. First of all, I have to say that the demand in critical raw materials will increase, and this is inevitable because of the, again, clean energy transition, because of the data centers, digitalization, which is happening. The population is growing. Everything, will demand this critical raw materials, so the need will increase. I think the attention to the sector will increase. but also not only attention, but also it will bring more leaders, it will bring more thinking, it will bring more discussions. We just need to make sure that we are doing this in the right way, that we are doing this in transparent way. We have such, discussions, honest discussions as we have today, that there are right people, there are right institutions, there are right support in this sector, and we will be, I think, in a good position.
Yeah. And Ryan, as you think about a lot of our audience that work in the global development space, that maybe this isn't top of their list of things to be thinking about or working on, why should they be paying attention to this issue specifically?
When we're building cities, very few people paid attention to the replacement of trees with concrete until this is so similar that the aspiration for great concrete fancy apartments that decimated all the trees, limited our biodiversity, in fact became a threat to our own existence. Critical minerals are not just something that industry needs. They are definitive of inclusive and sustainable futures in ways that ordinary people, as well as people who are highly sophisticated, will converge. If not done correctly, critical minerals extraction will reproduce the sort of unpalatable labor and unacceptable labor standards, environmental outcomes, and social outcomes that are worse than the extraction of coal and other natural resources did. What this opportunity actually presents is a reimagination of development. The pathway to development will require, or whether or not it deems that it requires, the digitalization we talked about, enhanced the new forms of technology, new forms of communication, new forms of are all require critical minerals. As the world population grows, there will be very little in terms of non-renewable energy to go around, so we require alternatives. As space becomes a little bit more constricted, we will require alternatives. These alternatives have to be imagined in economic terms. And imagining those in technological and economic terms essentially means we're imagining the role of critical minerals. There's security. We have returned over the last 5 years to an age we thought we would never return to, because researchers and others have said because we've solved the problem of hunger, we've solved the problem of, therefore the world has no reason to return to war. But if we mismanage critical minerals, as we have seen in the Congo and elsewhere, without properly governing the critical minerals sector, we will return to war. So whether at the global level they manifest as this great power rivalry, in the areas that are rich in critical minerals, it will be live warfare. We should not have another Ukraine. We should not have another Democratic Republic of the Congo. We should not have another Northern Mozambique. Because if you look at the children and a generation that has lost any sense of peace or stability as a result of war. And imagine that for the increase in demand of critical raw minerals, in the absence of regulatory frameworks and international consensus, some form of ensuring that we don't use crude methods to access these resources, then we will have war in more places than the world can afford. Just if you look at the sheer cost of the war in Ukraine and in the Congo, but the sheer human cost, the environmental cost. So those who are working in development have to imagine this not as a distant problem, not as a vexation of scientists, geologists, and venture capitalists. They have to imagine this as the essence of what will either undo or consolidate the efforts and the gains made in development. That's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think you have both laid out really well with the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. So thank you so much for your time. And we will continue to report on and cover the role of critical minerals in the development of many of the economies, as well as the World Bank spring meetings. So please follow our coverage on Devex.com and follow our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Belena and Brian, thank you. And thank you to Open Society Foundations for sponsoring this special edition episode.